Leviticus 20, verse 26 is the only verse we'll be looking at. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the people, that you should be mine. So the command, be holy. Be holy, be righteous. Live a righteous and pure life. Be set apart. I mean, notice that who he's saying this to. His people, he says, you shall be holy. You shall be holy. Right? Aren't there questions sometimes about in Christianity? It's like, well, what part of this is on me versus on God? What do I got to do? What's my part of this? He says there's a promise for holiness in Romans 8:28. He says, those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Right? He sets it in stone that his people are going to be conformed to the image of his Son. You know, we understand that as a progressive thing. But here, look, it's you. You shall be holy. You don't ride along like it's a roller coaster where, you know, whether you consent or not, from moment to moment, it's just always charging ahead in the exact same way. You have to be holy. I have to be holy. There's a responsibility placed on the individual. You carry it out. You think about how it has to get done. And I'll have you notice this too. That you shall be holy. Unconditional. Now, there are a lot of conditional commandments in Scripture. Even right here in Leviticus. Like, if such and such happens, then you carry out the act of obedience. If the circumstance happens, right? Like I think of if your bull grazes in your neighbor's field, then you'll repay your neighbor. If you break your Nazirite vow, then you bring a sacrifice. Right? We could imagine a Christianity that's just a bunch of conditional things, and there are a lot of conditional things. Right? If you come across nudity in a movie, then don't look. But this commandment is unconditional. You shall be holy at all times. There's no if that happens. There's no special circumstance that grants us to seek purity and goodness any less. As you wake up, you shall be holy. As you walk down the hallway, you shall be holy. In every movie theater, in every group of people, in every home, in every choice of song to listen to, in every choice of what you put in front of your eyes, in every website you go to, in every joke you tell or don't tell, you shall be holy. In every mood, in every emotion, in every bit of grief or depression or lack of self-control, you shall be holy. There is nothing to ever allow us to be anything else. And he says, you shall be holy to me. This thing you're doing, this act of devotion, is not some directionless exertion of energy. It's going somewhere. And to be obedient or disobedient to God, I mean, imagine if if we're just sitting here, imagine an angel showed up, shining in light, holding a sword of fire, and tells you, be holy to me. and everyone else around you is just cowering in fear. It's like, this is dangerous. This thing's powerful. And you just immediately spit on it. It's like, seems like kind of an offense, right? That's a powerful thing. That's a holy thing. But then sit in front of the computer and think of going to a certain website and you know God says, don't do that, you shall be holy to me. You go, no. I mean, that's worse. Because we're not being holy to an angel or holy just to the law, but to God himself, who made the law, who made that angel, and the angels bow down afraid of him. There's more of a responsibility. There's more of a gravity to it because the one making the call is higher. I mean, I don't need to say anything else than I just did to say, this is difficult. Your entire life as a Christian has this calling on it. And it bears a higher responsibility. But looking at this passage, I am convinced that the things he says, if we believe them, not just, oh, if I try super hard, but if we believe these things and go into action, believed with these things, armed with these things, I mean, a person does not live perfectly until they get to heaven. But you know what it looks like when you're in that fight and seeing victory, and then you fail, and then you go to God and you say, okay, let's get back in there. You know that looks different from other times. So I'm just going to give us 3 things. 3 motivations to personal holiness. Because he gives us 3 reasons right here. The first is, you shall be holy to me. Why? For I, the Lord, am holy. You got to keep God's character in mind. And people start to get a soft view of who God is, an unbiblical view of who God is. People want to say, well, God's a cool guy. God is love. And God's love is an immense motivation for personal holiness, but he doesn't say, you shall be holy because I am loving. He wants us to know, you shall be holy for I am holy. You know, sometimes Christians start to put God's holiness in the background. I mean, we've talked about this before, right? That holiness is God's number 1 attribute. Say, well, he's all loving. Is he loving when he sends Satan into the fires he prepared for him? That's what he says, that hell was made for Satan. Is that loving? No, but it's holy. When God saves his people, it's loving, but it's holy. Everything he does is holy. It's his number 1 thing. But let me ask, when's the last time you overheard some Christians talking about God and hearing them mention anything about holiness? I'll tell you right now, this might sound like a strange sentence. I am in awe of God's holiness. I like God's holiness. And look, here's the thing. Here's the practical thing. If you start to forget God's holiness, it starts to feel comfortable to sin. Because it's like, well, maybe he's just annoyed at it. Or just kind of disapproving. People can end up putting God's holiness in the background. But here's the thing. It's not just his primary attribute. It's not just the number 1 thing he is God I listen to this, guys. God is proud of his holiness. There's Old Testament prophecy about Jesus. This ends up getting quoted in Hebrews 1 that says, "You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness." What's God's holiness? Righteousness or wickedness? Right? God's holiness is important to him, and he is glad to show it. It's not like sometimes someone's, like, oh, they're pretty good in the instrument, but they kind of keep it a secret because they don't want to make it a big deal. This part of them. There's no such part of God that he hides, that he is ashamed of, or keeps in the background. He's out to express all of himself, and he is proud of his holiness. He is pretty happy with it. I, the Lord, am holy. I mean, what if we made this the framework of our thinking? As I'm waking up, as I start, if I start thinking, well, it's not that big of a hit. It's not so bad. I did okay last week. I had a spiritual experience last week or yesterday or today, so I can take this one hit. It won't be so bad. You see what you're doing is you're just comparing yourself along your own timeline. God's not in the equation. God always brings himself into the equation. I, the Lord, am holy. It interrupts that line of thinking of, well, it's not going to be such a big hit. You stop thinking about how much of a hit it's going to be and start thinking, he's holy. In Leviticus chapter 10, I won't make you turn there, there are a couple guys who clearly did not have a very high regard for God's holiness. Nadab and Abihu were Moses' nephews. And this is after some very plain laws have been laid down about how to offer sacrifices, how to give offerings to God in the temple. And we don't know exactly what, but they broke the rules. Pretty obvious to them that they were breaking the rules. They're getting near to the holy place. It's not to be dealt with lightly. If someone had an illness, they couldn't go in there. It had to be a sacred place. What do you guys suppose happened when
into flames?
Yeah. Fire literally comes down from heaven and consumes them. And they're dead. When you put God's holiness in the background, it makes you comfortable with sinning. We can give ourselves negative reinforcements like that. That can be very useful. And those guys obviously didn't. And I'm not saying that as a threat to Christians, but I'm saying right there you see A, people not thinking about God's holiness, going and just doing what they felt like, being comfortable with doing that, and B, you see God's holiness revealed by fire. What does it do to someone to look at God's holiness? We talked a while ago about Isaiah in Isaiah 6. He goes into the temple and he has this vision of God. Isaiah was a holy man. He was already a prophet. He was already writing stuff down. And when he sees God and the seraphs singing, "Holy, holy, holy," he says, "Woe to me, I am undone." Like, I'm screwed. I am in trouble. He says, why? Because I'm a man of unclean lips. I can tell you what Isaiah didn't run out and do right after that, is go, say a bunch of sinful things. because he'd seen God's holiness. He was reminded of how pure God is. If you ever start forgetting how pure God is, so these guys came one time with disobedience, fire. Now, we should focus on that. We should remember God's holy. As I'm thinking about whether or not to go to this movie, as I'm thinking about how to spend my time, or what it's going to look like, the 15 minutes before I go to bed, to think God is holy. God is holy. But also, he says, you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine. That's the second thing we're looking at here, is be holy because you're one of God's people. I mean, you might feel like, well, I've sinned so much, I really don't have a right to call myself one of God's people. No one has earned that right. No one's earned that right. John chapter 1 says, to all those who believed, he gave the right to become children of God. He gave that right. Not because they earned 30 days clean. Not because they evangelized enough or read the Bible to a satisfactory amount or cleaned up their language enough, but those who believed the right to become children of God. The issue is people being self-defined. You see out in the culture, people are self-defined. Well, I don't believe I was born the gender that I should be, so I'm deciding. My parents want me to be this way, but I'm deciding. Oh, society's trying to put me in this box. I'm deciding. And it can bleed into the church. Not such an obvious way, but I've been bad recently, so I'm going to define myself as lost, even though God has said otherwise. I'm going to make it happen so quickly. A good day or a good week. And then some hard hits from sin. Some very bad things. You do some bad things and you're like, well, I must be. What am I now? We're not meant to be self-defined. You know one of the other ways this happens? Is people start thinking, well, those other guys are the real Christians. The other guys are the real Christians. Those guys who know more than I do, or have gifts I don't have that I wish I had, or they're having a good month right now and I'm really not. I must just be a stepchild of God. Self-defined. I'll tell you, being self-defined when God has said otherwise is arrogant, is wrong. There's no such thing as a stepchild of God. There's no such thing as a sub-Christian. You're in or you're out. You're in or you're out. And if you're in, it's a child of God. Child of God. Though all who believed, he gave the right to be called a children of God. Called by who? By other people? Other people don't always call you a child of God. Called by God. That's his declaration. That's how he's made it. Don't say anything otherwise. I've separated you from the people that you should be mine. And when you preach that to yourself, when you remind yourself of that, then this question comes up is, do I really want to behave like one of God's enemies? Do I really want to do that? I mean, he compares them, Israel, God's people, to the nations. If we scroll back a few verses, the paragraph before this, he lists all these sins, and he's like, don't do these things because the nations did these things, and I punished them, and the land vomited them out. That shows up a few times in Leviticus. It's like, that's what happens to them. And it's not only this threat of punishment. It's this, you're mine. You're not them. You're not them. I mean, get thinking that you're one of God's people. What if you're sitting there and this, inclination, this feeling says, go to that website. Or do that, say that, treat my parents like that. If you say, no, I'm a man of God. It obliterates that. I'm a man of God. Let me give you this image. Let's say you're a soldier in a war. You're on the losing side. You're on the bad side, and then the general from the other army comes over and says, "Hey, I'll let you live. Why don't you come over and fight for me?" And he brings you in, gives you new gear, new clothing, lets you eat with him, and you're like, okay, this is great. I'm on this side now. And then, and this sounds stupid, you wake up the next morning with amnesia and start thinking you're on the other side that you were on at first. The general walks in to say hi, you pull out your gun and shoot him immediately. And that's kind of ridiculous, but it happens to us every single day. If you forget who you are, if you think you're something you're not, you're going to start behaving like that. You're going to start behaving like that. Ephesians 5 verse 3 says, "But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you," here it is, "as is proper among the saints." That God's people need to be holy because He can't have a people who are unlike Him. Otherwise, they're not His people. They're just some people. And it really naturally follows when you get a firm, I'm one of His. I'm one of His. I'm on His side. He's on my side. I'm one of His. The life in the question of holiness versus unholiness really follows in suit. I mean, the consistent plea of the New Testament writers to the church is, remember what you are. Remember what you are. And now don't act like something else. A man of God. A man of God. Now move on to the last thing here. Because even when someone is remembering God is holy, I'm one of His, a certain fear can seep in. The third thing is, be holy because God has separated you. It's not that they're His by default. It's not that they're His because they made it that way themselves. They're His only by this. You are only a man of God by this, that He has separated you to be one of His people. He has done it. the lie that comes in so often is, okay, well maybe I'm a forgiven guy. I have this new identity as a child of God, but now it's just a balancing act. Trying every single day not to fall off into the pit of hell. I got to stay on top of things because otherwise God will get annoyed with me and say, well, you acted enough like one of my enemies that I'm going to transition, we're going to redo some paperwork and that's what you're going to be now. Or that God demotes you into lesser levels. There's no such thing. There's only those who are his people and those who are not, and those who are his people. Look, the lie is that my position and identity depend on my personal holiness. That is not the truth, not in the new covenant. It's that my identity and my position depend only on what God has done. Only. Look, I have separated you. He has done this. I have separated you. Have separated. Is that future, present, or past tense?
Present.
Well, have.
Past.
Have is present, but separated. Past tense. A completed action. Yeah, you're right. He does use two words there, but have separated. It's complete, and God is the one who has done it. For you and for me. It's not just, well, I made the door for salvation, and I'm going to sit on the other side as I watch you, trip and stumble your way through. He brings you through. God has acted on your behalf, and it is a completed action that does not depend on the individual. And any time you lose any sight of that, the only result is pain and wandering and sin that just gets a person down. You got to focus on the truth of salvation to live this life, specifically in this case, the truth that God has separated you, has done this. That's the biggest truth here. The biggest truth. It changes everything. When you see your holiness is so dramatically incomplete, you got to see how God's work is complete. When you see your inability, you got to see God's ability. When you see what's so hard to get started, you have to see what God has finished. Now, what he's finished is the same thing you're trying to do. I mean, look, here he's speaking to ethnic Israel. How did he separate them from the peoples? By taking them out of Egypt. It might at one time, you might have looked at a bird's eye view and gone, Israel, Egypt, I can't really tell the difference. They seem to be kind of one thing. And at one point, you and I were the same thing as sin. The same thing as our sin. But look at what he did with Israel. He didn't just give them a sword to fight their way out. He didn't just part the Red Sea and say, okay guys, run pretty fast, the enemy's coming. He did it. He started it. He sustained it. He completed it. God starts salvation. God continues it. God completes it. No matter how hard of a speed bump you hit in the middle, even if that speed bump sends you into the air and you fall and hit your head. If you still see him as your only hope, if you still see Jesus as your only hope, it's not a lost cause. And they did get weapons for war eventually. They did get to war eventually, but it's after they've been separated. God doesn't give you the means to fight sin so that you can be separated for him. He gives you the means to fight sin after he has separated you. And just as he took them, he separated them, he did it. He separated them from the nations. Jesus separates his people from sin. And is completed right now. That bird's eye view is no longer the same thing in God's eyes. It might look crappy in your eyes, but in God's eyes, you and your sin are completely separated because of Jesus. Look at this, Hebrews 10:14 says of Jesus, it says, "For by a single offering," which is death, by a single offering, he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. For all time. Perfected. I wish I could reach inside you guys' brains and just write this, just like branding iron, put this there. He is perfected for all time as a final thing. That is my prayer for us. That we would just know that and believe that. I'll tell you something. It doesn't even depend on you believing that promise right now. Perfected for all time. Nothing is going to come up against that. So, we can fight for personal holiness. We can see success. I have, in the month I took away, this is one of the verses I meditated on, and things changed. I saw victory. I am not where I once was. I am not where I was 3 months ago. It's because of these truths. Number 1, that God is holy. Number 2, that I am one of his. Number 3, that he has separated me. Not that I separated myself. Just imagine, guys, you start calling yourself a man of God. Not a boy, not a teenager, not primarily a musician or anything else, fill in the blank. A man of God. Imagine if in the morning or before going into some place full of lost people, you think to yourself, God is pure. God utterly disapproves of these actions. And God has separated me. God has made me holy, separated me from my sin. I want to be careful not to behave in this way, think this way, because God detests those things. And he doesn't detest me because Jesus has perfected me.